So in case you guys have missed my last couple of videos, I've been going over the basics of building your own cabinets. And so I started the series with a video on how I build cabinet boxes. Then I followed that up with a video on building drawer boxes and choosing drawer slides and installing them. And now I want to cover cabinet doors and drawer fronts, because that's obviously a whole nother part of the equation, and it's really one of the last things you'll have to build when you're building cabinets. And so in this video, I want to talk about the different styles of cabinet doors and drawer fronts. I want to talk about some of the hardware options there, how to size your doors, and then how to actually install them. And so I guess let's get started with one of the most basic things when you're deciding on your cabinet doors, and that is what style you're gonna build your doors. And so there's really two popular styles. You've got your slab doors, which, as the name implies, they're just one flat slab of wood. These can be solid wood, or I think more commonly sheet goods. And this is definitely the style I prefer. It fits that kind of modern aesthetic that I enjoy in my furniture pieces. But then the other very popular style is gonna be your kind of shaker style or frame and panel door or drawer front. They're a little bit more involved to build, but there are a ton of different styles when it comes to this kind of shaker style raised panel, so you can really customize the looks of your cabinets by building different types of doors. So there are a few things to consider with slab doors. First of all, what material you're gonna build them out of. As I mentioned, you can use solid wood, but you might run into a little bit of trouble with warping and seasonal movement unless you add something like strong backs or sliding dovetails to the back of the door. So typically these are built out of some sort of sheet good. In this case, this is some radiata pine plywood. MDF is another great choice, especially if you're gonna be painting your doors or drawer fronts, because you'll get a really nice smooth panel with no edge banding work. It's gonna save you a ton of time. And in my experience, MDF doors and drawer fronts hold up really well as long as they're finished well. If you go with something like plywood, you're probably going to end up adding some edge banding to the edges of the piece, unless you want to see those exposed plywood edges, which is a look I definitely like. And so a lot of times with my slab drawer fronts or doors, I will just leave them as is with the edges exposed, add a little edge profile like a chamfer or a roundover, sand them up, maybe fill in any big voids, and I think they look great. So when it comes to building slab doors and drawer fronts, it's obviously pretty simple. You're basically just cutting rectangles. I think the table saw is by far the easiest way to make these. But one thing you should keep in mind is that just like when you're building your cabinet boxes, you always want to be aware of that factory edge, and you want to make sure to cut that factory edge off so you get a nice clean square edge. This is especially important if you're going to be adding edge banding, because that factory edge is usually pretty ragged and your edge banding isn't going to bond as well because that surface is so uneven. One other tip is if you're going to be leaving your plywood edges exposed like I am on this project, is to go ahead and add a nice edge profile. I think it really enhances the look and can really transform the appearance from a rectangular piece of plywood to a more finished piece. And in this case, I added an 1/8 inch roundover to all of the edges, front and back of these drawer fronts, because the last thing I want in a finished piece of furniture or cabinetry is a sharp edge. It's going to get damaged more easily, and it's pretty easy to bang your hand into that when you're grabbing something out of the cabinet, and nobody wants that. And then once the edge profile is added, all that's left to do is a little sanding, and these things are ready for installation. When it comes to frame and panel doors and drawer fronts, you have a ton more options. First of all, you have to decide what you're gonna build the door out of. Your rails and stiles can be solid wood, they can be MDF. You could even use plywood if you wanted, maybe edge banded ahead of time to get a solid wood look. You also need to decide on the width of your rails and stiles, and that will make a big impact on the finished look of the piece. In this case, these are 1 3/4 wide, but you could go 2 inches, 2 1/4. There's also this new trend of slim shaker style doors, which are not really shaker style doors. They're basically slab doors with a trim on the edge that makes them look like they're thin shaker style doors, because if you tried to make your stiles too narrow, you're gonna have issues with your hinges not having a place to be installed. That is, if you're gonna be using concealed hinges, which I personally would recommend. You've also got a ton of options for building these doors. You could use a table saw to cut in all the joinery. You could use a router table with a specialty router bit set. If you're just starting out and maybe not super comfortable with your table saw, you could use pocket screws or dowels, because really at the end of the day, these are just some basic butt joints. So obviously there are a lot of options for joinery. When it comes to your panel, you also have a bunch of options there. A lot of people will use sheet goods because then you don't have to account for any seasonal movement. If you want to use solid wood, you could do something like a raised panel, which will allow for seasonal movement. You could also use a glass panel, and I built some doors for my home bar with glass, and I used a kind of custom router bit set so I could cut all the joinery for the doors and the grooves for the glass and some little strips of wood that held the glass in place all in one go, and I have an entire video on that process if you want to check that out. But needless to say, there are a ton of options when it comes to your frame and panel doors, so just pick one you like and go for it. Let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Fantic. So I've been checking out their S1 Apex and E1 Max drivers, and I am super impressed. I think these would make a great addition to anyone's garage, house, or shop. The S1 Apex is the larger of the two drivers, and it comes in this awesome magnetic storage case, which is preloaded with 20 commonly used bits. The S1 Apex features this really cool folding mechanism that allows you to adjust the tool to fit into tighter spots. You can also adjust the torque setting by twisting the front of the driver, which will help to keep from stripping or breaking screws. And in my opinion, the S1 Apex is the perfect driver to keep in your truck or as an extra driver in the shop because it's great for things like installing cabinet hardware. The E1 Max is Fantic's solution for driving those teeny tiny screws you see in all kinds of electronics and even things like glasses. The kit includes 50 bits, tweezers, and a small pry bar, and has basically everything you'd need for finer electronics work. The E1 Max is also great for things like installing outlet plate covers, tightening loose cabinet handles, and changing batteries in kids' toys, something I've been using it for a lot lately. And best of all, there's no external chargers to deal with. Both of these devices are charged via USB-C, and they have plenty of battery life to get through multiple hours of work before needing to charge again. If you're interested in checking out the S1 Apex or E1 Max for yourself, use my coupon code for 37% off the E1 Max and 42% off the S1 Apex. Thanks again to Fantic for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. So next, let's take a look at building a shaker style frame and panel door using just the table saw. For this example, I'm just using a scrap of some 1x material that I'm going to rip down for my rails and stiles. For the center panel, I'm just going to be using a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. And so I went ahead and got my dimensions figured out in SketchUp. I think that's a good idea because in my opinion, it's pretty easy to accidentally cut, especially your rails too short if you don't factor in that tenon you need to cut. So I have my cut list here, and I can go ahead and get to cutting, and then I can cut in the joinery. So let's go ahead and break down these parts to their final size, and then we can cut in the grooves to make them a frame and panel door. So after cutting all my parts to size, I went ahead and labeled the front face of each of the pieces. That being said, that's not really going to matter as much with the method I use here on the table saw because the groove that we need to cut here on the inside edge of all these pieces will be perfectly centered. And so the way I do that is I take a flat ground blade. That is pretty important because otherwise the bottom of your groove will have some ridges left by that alternating tooth pattern on the blade. So I'm using a ripping blade in this case, but any flat ground blade will work. The key is to choose a blade that's only about 1/8 of an inch thick, because while this is called 1/4-inch plywood, it is not 1/4 of an inch. It's actually more like 3/16 of an inch. So if I tried to use my 1/4-inch box joint blade that I use for a lot of my drawer bottoms and stuff like that, I would end up with a really loose fitting panel, and then every time you open and close that door, you might get some rattling, which obviously we don't want. So what I did was go ahead and mark out the center of this first piece, and I marked 1/8 of an inch area in the center of that, and now I'm just lining up the piece with the blade so that it's cutting roughly centered. The reason it doesn't matter if it's perfect is because I'm going to make a pass, flip the piece around, make another pass, and then I know that even if I'm off by a 32nd of an inch, the groove will still be perfectly centered because I flipped the piece around. And then after making that initial pass, all I need to do is continue bumping my fence over little by little and running the pieces through until I have a good fit with my plywood panel. And then I know I'm good to go to run the same setting on the rest of my pieces to get perfectly centered grooves. Once I had the grooves cut on all the pieces, I could get set up to cut the tenons on the end of both of the rails. And just in case you want a refresher, rails are the horizontal part. The way I remember that is that handrails are horizontal. So the rails on your cabinet doors are horizontal, and then the vertical parts are the stiles. And so on this door, my tenons are gonna be 3/8 of an inch long because our groove was 3/8 of an inch deep. First, I set my blade height, and I basically wanted it to be flush with the inside edge of that groove I'd cut. And I kept it a little bit low to start just so I could sneak up on that fit. And then once that was set, I could set my fence to be 3/8 of an inch away from the inside edge of that blade. So once all that was set up, I could get my initial cuts made, and I'm using a miter gauge here to help with these cuts, and this also really helps to prevent tear out because it supports the back edge of the piece as it's being cut. After cutting the first tenon, I went ahead and did a test fit, and as I suspected, the tenon was too thick, so I could raise my blade height just a tiny amount and recut the tenon. And once again on this second try, it was still a little bit too thick, so once again I raised the blade just a tiny bit, and the third time was the charm here, and I ended up with a pretty much perfect fit on this tenon. And so with the setup dialed in, I could repeat the process to cut the tenons on the other end of this first rail and the tenons on the second rail. So then once all the pieces are cut, you can do a quick dry fit, make sure everything is looking good. I'd say that looks pretty good. I think the important things to check are that our final dimensions are what we want them. 14 and 7/8, 26 and 5/8. That is perfect. So now I can go ahead and glue this thing up. And so when you're gluing up these frame and panel doors, the only places that really need glue are the tenons, because that is what's providing all the structure to these doors. You could add a tiny little dab inside the groove in a couple spots just to keep the center panel from rattling, but otherwise it's pretty easy glue up. It's looking good. Let's see if we can square measurement here. 29 and 5/8, 29 and 5/8. All right, cool. So I was gonna add a segment in this video where I showed how to build shaker style doors with a router bit set, but this router bit set is brand new because I don't really build a lot of shaker style doors. It's not really my thing. And so figured instead, why not give this set away? This is a Whiteside 5990 router bit set. I think this thing's like 140, 150 bucks. So to enter, all you need to do is subscribe to my email newsletter, and I'll link to that in the video description below, and leave a comment on this video telling me what you would build with this router bit set, and I'll announce the winner in a couple weeks. I'll respond to your comment and shoot you an email, and I will ship this anywhere in the world, so this is open to everybody, and good luck. So next, let's talk about some hardware options. So on your doors, you're obviously gonna need some hinges, and in my opinion, concealed hinges are far and away the best option for cabinetry doors because they have a ton of adjustment, they're hidden in the finished installation, and you can get them in different colors, different styles, different hinge rotation angles, soft close, and really these hinges aren't that much more expensive than your basic kind of old school hinges, which offer basically no adjustability, no soft close functionality, and they're visible in the finished piece. So unless you're going for that style where you want to see the hinges in the finished piece, I would highly recommend concealed hinges. Now, if you looked at your hinges area at your local home center or woodworking supply store, you'll know that there are also a ton of options within the concealed hinge category. You've got overlay versus inset, which will determine whether your finished installed doors will be sitting on top of your face frame or edge of your cabinet, or inset so they're flush with the edge of your cabinets. Speaking of face frames, you've also got options for face frame hinges or frameless cabinet hinges. And in my case, I am using frameless cabinet hinges because the cabinets I'm installing on them are frameless or Euro style cabinets, which is my preferred cabinet style. And then as I mentioned earlier, you have options for hinge rotation if you want the doors to open super wide, or maybe you're installing them in a corner and you know you want them to stop at 90 degrees so they're not banging into the adjoining wall all the time. And there are even more options for other odd situations. I know I used some 90-degree hinges when I built a corner cabinet for the kitchen in the tiny house. You can make bifold doors for corner cabinets with another type of hinge. So again, look into your options. There's a ton out there. I actually have a Bloom manual of their concealed hinges, and it is like over 100 pages long, and the entire manual is full of hinge details. So it can be a little overwhelming, but I'll link to the kind of basic hinges that I use in the video description below, and they're the ones I would recommend unless you have some weird situation or scenario. So when it comes to installing concealed hinges, just like the rest of my cabinetry project, I rely heavily on jigs because installing concealed hinges is a pretty precise operation and it can be a little tricky without these jigs. And so there's a few that I would definitely recommend if you're just kind of starting out and you want something inexpensive. Craig makes an excellent concealed hinge jig. This is not sponsored or anything, but it includes the bit you need, which is a 35mm Forstner bit. It has this little guide built in so you can drill the hole for the actual hinge cup, as well as the holes for the screws that mount the hinge to the inside of the door. It also allows you to set your offset or tab, because different types of hinges are gonna have a different offset. Basically, how far away from the inside edge of your door the hinge is located will be dictated by that tab. And so with a lot of the hinges I install, I have a 5mm tab, but that info will be in the instructions that come with your hinges or the technical documentation on their website. Another great option is this Bloom Eco Drill. It is obviously a much more robust option. So if you install a bunch of hinges, this is also great for, I think, home defense or self-protection. This thing is a solid chunk of steel, but it's really cool because it has 3 bits built in. So you've got your central Forstner bit, and then you've got 2 other bits to drill the mounting holes. And this is actually set up for working with Bloom's Inserta hinges, which are really cool. They allow you to install and uninstall your hinges with a built-in clip rather than having to use screws. So if you want to take everything apart for finishing, it goes much faster with those clips rather than screws. This is a great option, but it is a lot more expensive. The Craig one, I don't know exactly, but it's definitely $30 to $40 or less. But once again, the Bloom is built to last a lifetime for sure. Another great option if you have a drill press is just to set up a basic fence on your drill press and set it up for drilling these hinge cup holes. And so to do that, I have another little jig here. This is just a piece of HDPE with a hole drilled out so that I can offset my drill press fence. I set the depth of my bit, and then I use 2 different stop blocks, both set at 4 inches, which is generally where I locate my hinges on my cabinet doors. And then I can just get to work drilling with the drill press. It goes super quick. The setup is a little bit fiddly, so I personally would only use a drill press if I had a bunch of doors to batch out. Otherwise, I think either one of these jigs is great for, 1 or 2 doors. There's also really fancy options if you're like a cabinet shop or something like that. Obviously, you probably already know about this, but there are dedicated machines that will drill all 3 of those holes in one shot for the Bloom hinges. And so if you're looking to up your efficiency or speed, that's a great option. Or you can cut in those hinge cups and holes over at the CNC if you've got a CNC. But so let's rewind a little bit and talk about where exactly you locate your hinges on the inside of your doors. And really this is kind of arbitrary. So as I mentioned, I usually set these in about 4 inches, and that number is just easy for me to keep in my head throughout the whole project. So I install the other half of the hinges on the inside of the cabinets 4 inches from the outer edge. And then I do the same thing here on the doors. The other nice thing is that a lot of these jigs have the very edge of the jig located at 4 inches. And so all I gotta do is line that edge up with the edge of my door and I'm good to go. And the same is also true with the Bloom jig. Then once the hinge plates are installed in the cabinets and the hinges are installed on the doors, I can go ahead and get the doors attached to the cabinets. And that is, I think, the best thing about these concealed hinges is that it is really easy to install and remove your doors. The hinges just clip into place on those hinge plates, and then you can make whatever adjustments you might need. And there is a ton of adjustability built into these hinges. You can adjust them up and down, in and out, and side to side to dial in your fit. And all of this adjustment really helps to account for any sort of issues with your cabinets being out of square. And it also allows you to add things like felt pads or rubber bumpers, and those pads can really help to keep the paint from sticking on your freshly painted cabinet doors and cabinet boxes, and it also can reduce any noise if you don't have soft close hinges. So next, let's head over to this bank of cabinets I'm working on and talk about sizing your cabinet doors and drawer fronts, because again, there are a ton of options there as well. So in my opinion, people tend to really overthink sizing their cabinet doors. I don't think it has to be particularly complicated, especially if you're building frameless cabinets. It is super simple. So to get my cabinet door size, I take the exterior dimension of the cabinet box. So let's call it 36 by 24, and I subtract a 1/16 from each edge. So 1/8 of an inch total across the width and across the height. And so in this case, for a 36 by 24 cabinet, we would have a 35 and 7/8 tall door by 23 and 7/8 wide. And basically all that does is give me a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to installing the doors, and it will also ensure that I have between an 1/8 and a 1/16 of an inch gap between each of my cabinet doors. And having a gap here is important. Obviously, first of all, it allows for adjustability, but you also need a little bit of a gap for clearance. Now, the way these hinges work, they can be pretty dang tight, the doors can, but I would make this gap a minimum of a 1/16 of an inch, if not an 1/8. I think it's a lot easier to get everything looking nice and even when you have that 1/8 of an inch of wiggle room. Sizing your drawer fronts is a very similar process. I basically just figure out where the gaps are between each of my drawers, take that measurement, and then I'll subtract an 1/8 of an inch from the height and an 1/8 of an inch from the width to make sure I have an 1/8 of an inch gap between each drawer front, as well as a 1/16 of an inch gap around the edges of the cabinet. So my process for installing the drawer fronts is pretty simple. I start from the bottom and work my way up. If I'm installing these on the workbench, I'll add 1/16 of an inch shims between the workbench and the bottom drawer front. In this case, I just clamped on a flat piece of wood to basically act as my workbench. And once I get the drawer front centered on the cabinet, I'll go ahead and clamp it in place and then add a couple 1-inch screws from the inside of the drawer box to permanently attach it. From there, I just continue working my way up, and the only difference here is that now I'm gonna add an 1/8 inch spacer between the drawer fronts rather than the 1/16 of an inch. And you definitely could go with a 1/16 of an inch gap, but I personally like to have that little bit of extra wiggle room because I just think it makes it a lot easier when it comes time to adjust all of your drawer fronts so they all have a nice even gap. If there's anything I didn't cover in this video that you guys have questions about, feel free to leave a comment below. I try to respond to as many comments as I can. I'll also link to all the tools and materials I used in this video in the video description below. Don't forget to enter that router bit giveaway by subscribing to my email newsletter and leaving a comment telling me what you'd build with that router bit set. And last, while you're here, why not check out this other video of mine that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.